to start with promises, what I want to do is I want to start with just an HTML page. So I'm going to have an HTML page. So changing Atom to use HTML. Titling this promises. And I'll have my script tag. And what I want to do is I want to just start with a basic promise. And then why would we use this, and why is it better than an XML HTTP request? Like, where else can I use this, and how would it be used? So to start with, I just want to start with a basic promise. Okay, so I'm going to say I'm going to have a variable P for my promise. And the way I'm going to define a promise, and we're going to work away from this, I wouldn't use P as my promise variable name, but for this case, we're going to work away from that. But I just kind of want to show you the syntax to start with. So I'm going to say, I'm going to have a variable called P that's equal to a new promise. And the way the promise works is it takes two parameters, a function that occurs when we resolve the promise, and a function that would occur when we'd reject the promise. So I'm going to have two parameters, resolve and reject, and they're going to get passed into this promise. So I'm having a function that's passed into the promise, right? So the syntax looks a little bit like this. Because I'm passing a function into the promise, my function takes two parameters. Is everyone okay with that syntax? Okay, so this promise constructor takes a function that takes two arguments. What should happen when we resolve it? What should happen when we reject it? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just immediately resolve this promise. There's no time delay or anything like that. I just want to show you what that looks like. I'm going to resolve the promise saying, hey, Cubs stink. Okay, this is my version of hello world for promises. Okay, so then I've created that variable. I should then be able to say p.then, after it's resolved, what should happen? So I can do something, right? Like I'm going to get that data back. The resolved data that's going to get sent to me is Cubs stink. So in the then, I get passed that data from my promise, and then I'm going to do something with it. So if I just want to console.log the data, life should be okay there. So I'm going to save this as promises.html. And then I don't necessarily want this, so I'm going to remove the project folder. And then I just want to drag that file over to my browser. Okay, you'll notice I get Cubs stink. Great, right? It's working, no errors. That's a good start. Okay, so more realistically, though, we're going to use these promises to make requests for data that have some kind of time delay. Right? This isn't going to happen immediately. It's going to happen at some point in the future. Okay, so whether we're making an XML HTTP request that we then wrap in a promise, or we're making a fetch request, or if you get over to Node.js and we're making a database request, like there's some time delay built in there. The easiest way to mimic that in JavaScript is the set timeout function. Okay, so if I use the set timeout function, the set timeout function says, hey, give me some code to execute after X number of milliseconds. Okay, so with the set timeout function, it takes a function definition. So it takes a function definition that will execute. So here's my function definition, console.log, after waiting. Like that's what's going to happen after I wait. And then my wait interval is expressed in milliseconds. So if I say after 2 seconds, let's go ahead and run that code. Is everyone following with that? Set timeout. Basically, I'm saying, hey, wait 2 seconds, and then after those 2 seconds pass, let's execute this code, this function definition. Okay, so if I save this again, Okay, you'll notice I get cub stink right away, and then after 2 seconds, I get after waiting. Everyone good with that? If I make it 5 seconds, it'll be uncomfortable in here, but you'll see that delay. So there is no after waiting message in my console, and then after 5 seconds pass, then I get my message that function executes. That's what the set timeout does. It says basically sit and wait for that interval, which is expressed in milliseconds, and then after that interval passes, then go ahead and execute that function. And I'm using the term interval because there is an equivalent, which is set interval. Okay, so if I change this to set interval, and I'm going to make it every half a second, this is a little bit different in that that code is going to continue to execute every half second. This is not wait for half a second and then execute it. It's saying every half second, let's execute that code. So it's this repeating loop.
Does the program allow you to do other things during those waits?
So JavaScript is asynchronous for the most part. The one exception to that, like the easy exception, not everything is asynchronous. I could await things and stuff like that. The one like really common exception that you'll see in JavaScript is if I do an alert. Okay, so if I do an alert, you'll notice nothing else is happening. I'm not getting a bunch of alerts happening. Like that's not asynchronous. It's blocking that main thread. But for the most part, I can do other things. Like I'm not sitting there waiting. JavaScript is an asynchronous language. And that's why Node.js became popular. So when Twitter was built, it said, you know, look, we are really popular now and we got to send out and distribute these messages to all the people that would subscribe to a Twitter feed or a hashtag or whatever. We have to send all those messages out, and like the transaction processing became huge, and they tried to do it in Java and they never actually got it working. So then they built it in Node.js, and like that's the story, is they built it. It was kind of a precursor to Node.js. They built it, and so they could make it multi-threaded like this and just distribute it across a bunch of processes. Okay, as soon as I click OK to that alert, then it's going to continue executing. Yep. Okay, so set interval and set timeout are kind of basic building blocks of JavaScript. The reason I bring them up is because I can then use them for my promise to create a delay. Okay, so with my delay, I don't want to resolve, or with my promise, I don't want to resolve this right away. I want to resolve it after 2 seconds. Okay? Eventually I want to resolve it, but so I want to call set timeout. I know that this resolve is what I want to execute, and I want it to happen after 2 seconds. Here's the problem, is the set timeout takes a function definition as a parameter, and that's not what I'm giving it here because I have the beginning and ending parentheses to pass that parameter back, right? So the way I handle that is I wrap it in an anonymous function. Okay, so here's my anonymous function. And then that anonymous function will execute after 2 seconds, where I'll resolve it and then I'll log that data. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of this set interval, because it's going to be really annoying to have those alerts. Okay, but now I've changed it so that, interesting. Now I've changed it so that you'll notice I don't even get cub stink until after 2 seconds. I can kind of programmatically fake that 2 second wait time. Okay, so I'm going out, fetching some data, it takes 2 seconds, I come back, I resolve it after the data is actually there, and then I can resolve that transaction. So far, so good? Okay, what happens if instead of resolving this thing, I reject it? So instead of resolve, I use reject. So after 2 seconds, I decide, hey, something's wrong with this. There's a problem. I want to reject this thing. So I save it. I refresh this. After 2 seconds, you'll see I get an uncaught error. It's not great. in my browser, an uncaught error is not really that big a deal. It shows up in my console, and we're like, whatever. Like, probably shouldn't have it, but it's not the end of the world. If you have an uncaught error in Java or .NET, what happens? Yeah, your application crashes, and your user's screen does what? Well, if it's uncaught, poof, it's gone, right? Like, you've all dealt with that, where you're working on an application and all of a sudden, like, the application just shuts itself and closes. Like, that's an uncaught error. That's what we have here. Okay? That's what happens. So you don't necessarily see it as developers. You usually get error messages like this saying, hey, there's an uncaught error. And like, I think we get into a mindset as developers. It's like, oh yeah, like, it's not that big a deal. It's just telling me there's a problem. It's no big deal. But if you actually deploy that out to your end users, like, it is a big deal. Their application just crashes. Poof, poof, gone. So I want to actually catch that. So if I resolve this, then what should happen? Otherwise, I should catch my error. Okay. So now, if I refresh this, I'm still going to throw that error. But my error is not all that useful. Okay, so I'm catching an error. It might make more sense for me not to log it, but to output it as an error. I still have the same data, because that's what I said. I'm rejecting this with cub stink. So I still have the same data. But now when I log it, I'm logging it as an error. It tells me that that occurred on line 18. Is that really useful? Maybe. But I'd really prefer it telling me that it's on line 11, right? Like, that would be ideal, that it got rejected on line 11 for some reason. Like, hopefully it's not just arbitrary like I'm making it right now. The way you're going to get that error information is, instead of rejecting just a string, I'm going to reject an error. And I'm going to use that error constructor. So when I reject, I'm not just rejecting with a string, I'm rejecting with an actual error, and now I'm going to log that error, and it's going to use basically the toString method. Okay, and then if I dig into this, you can see that it actually gives me a little bit more detail about it on line 11. It's complaining. Everyone good with that? Okay, so let's get into an example where we might actually be doing something. Okay, so I don't want to set up a whole Node.js server to do this. Instead, what I want to do is I'm going to have a couple of different constants. So I'm going to have a constant for my students. And my students are going to be an array of objects. And to keep things simple, all my students are going to be is a name and an ID. Okay, so name, Bill Gates, ID 1. And then I'm just going to copy and paste that for like 3 or 4 students. Okay, so here's my students. Let me indent those. Oops. Steve Jobs. Jeff Bezos. And Elon Musk. Okay, so those are my students, that constant. And what I want to do is I want to write a function that will then get me a student by ID. So I'll have a function get student by ID. So const get student by ID. You're going to pass in an ID. And I will return the matching student. So I'm going to go to students.find. The find is going to then take another function definition where the ID is passed in. Get student by ID. equal to some function where I take in an ID and then I return students.find. I'm going to forward on the ID. And I'm basically going to say, I want the ID coming in, and I want to check if it's equal to the student. Sorry, student's got to come in. So I'm getting a student, and I'm checking if the student.id, I don't know why I'm skipping all over here, .id is equal to the ID that was passed in. And I can simplify this thing, right? I have one parameter, and I have one line of code where I return the value. Everyone good with that? One parameter, one line of code. Because I have one parameter, I don't need parentheses around it. Because I return from the first line, I have an implicit return. And this is what my function definition ends up looking like. I want to toggle soft wrap. And hopefully we can try this out. So we could say, you know, let's do a console.log of get student by ID with an ID of 2. So you'll see I get Steve Jobs, and eventually I get my error. If I change this to 4, you'll see I get Elon Musk. But let's assume that I'm on some Node.js server, and the data, instead of being this hard-coded constant, is actually in a database or a service that's going to provide those students. So there's some time delay when I actually do this search. So instead of having this function that returns a student, I want this function that returns a promise of a student. Okay? Everyone good with that? Okay, so then my function definition right here, I'm still going to go find that student. And then I can do an if the student, whoops, else. So what I actually want to do is I want to return a new promise. How do I do that? Can I just say return new promise, resolve, reject. Is that okay? Then I can go ahead and move this stuff into the promise, because it's just a function definition, right? Is everyone okay with that? That I moved it? So, like, I'm just going to undo that for a second. We were finding the student, and then I want to do this conditional. If I find a student, then I'm going to resolve with that student. If I don't, then I'm going to reject, saying there was no student found. Like that's kind of the logic. So now I've set this up so that my return value is now a promise. And I'm going to actually write that code to say, how do I actually resolve or reject that promise? So that's where this code is that we just wrote. Okay, so now I'm going to resolve with the student, or I'm going to reject with an error saying no student was found. Okay. So now this gets a little bit different, right? Like this code is going to look a little different. I'm going to say get my student by ID. Doesn't matter what number I pass in. Then I'm going to get back a student that I can pass on to my function. And now I can do a console.log of my student. Okay, so now I come back over to my promises. You'll notice I get Jeff Bezos. It's immediate because I'm looking at my local file system for this local variable. So it's in memory to in memory. So basically I'm looking at kind of the same memory allocation for this application. That's why it's really quick to access this data, as opposed to, if I really wanted to, I could set a timeout in here to mimic some kind of time delay to say, oh yeah, after half a second, then I'll actually return that promise. Okay, but I don't have to. So far, so good? Life's good. Okay, so then I have these students. What if I also have registrations? So a student's going to register for classes. Okay, so before I get into registration, let's talk about courses. Right? So I have a collection of courses, and then my course object, I might have like a course title, advanced JavaScript, and course ID. And then I can just kind of copy and paste this. So 3 different classes that we're going to offer. So advanced JavaScript, JavaScript frameworks, and Node.js. What's that? You want it to be the same? It should. Okay, so then based on those students and those courses, we should be able to have registrations, right? So here's my registrations. And the way a registration is going to work is I'm going to take a student ID. So let's say Bill Gates. And then he's going to take a particular course ID, and he'll take Node.js. And let's go ahead and have a couple of registrations. Okay, so Bill Gates wants to take Node.js. He wants to take JavaScript frameworks. Elon Musk wants to take Node.js, and Jeff Bezos is going to take advanced JavaScript. So these are my registrations. Everyone good with the data? Okay, so then I'm going to want a similar method that allows me to get a course by ID. It's almost the exact same. Almost the same, except I'm not looking for my students, I'm looking for a course. Oops. I wonder why that indented that so far. It didn't copy it. It must have. So I'm passing in a course. I'm not looking in my courses. I'm not looking in students. I'm looking in courses. I get passed a course, and I'm saying, is that course's ID matching the ID? If the course exists, resolve it. Otherwise, no course was found. Okay? So we should be able to then use that method as well. So we should be able to say, get a course by ID, passing in 1, then we get a course, and we can log that course. Okay, you'll notice we get our advanced JavaScript for course ID 1. If we said course ID of 2, we'd get a different course. We get JavaScript frameworks. Okay, easy enough. So now, with registrations. Okay, so what if I want to take all of my registrations and fully populate the details? Okay, so instead of having the registrations with just the IDs, because if I'm looking at this data, this doesn't mean a ton to me. What if instead, for student ID, I want the actual student with an ID of 1, and for the course with the course ID of 3, I want the actual course. So I want all of the raw data for all of my registration objects, so I can hand it off to someone else and say, hey, you deal with this. So right now, if I just said, here's the registrations, and I didn't give any other context, you're out of luck, right? So now I want to handle all of this registration information. Can I take my registrations and map them? Everyone good with that? So I'm going to create some constant registration details where I take the registrations, I map it to some function definition. I'm going to get a registration as an input parameter, and then this is the function that I want. So far, so good. Now what? I can go through each registration, right? Like this is what that map's going to do. It's going to say, okay, go through. I know that you got a few registrations, how many ever you have. I'm going to go through each one. I have a registration object. That registration object has a student ID and a course ID. So if I just kind of, let me comment out some of this other detail. Okay, so I'm just going to do a console.log of the registration dot student ID and the course ID. Well, you tell me. Can I do this console.log? Okay, so the way the map works is I want to return something, and then that return value ends up being the value in my new array. Do I have to return something? Or could my new array just be empty because I'm never returning anything? Okay, so I think this should loop through either way. Okay, and if I looked at this registration details object, I'm not returning anything, so I don't have that object built out the way I want it to be. But I think I can use map just to kind of loop through my objects like I wanted to there. Okay, that's not what I want to do, but you can see I'm getting the student ID and I'm getting the course ID, but like that's kind of meaningless, even if I put some kind of qualifier here, right? So if I say, you know, this is the student ID, and this is the course ID. I don't know that that actually gives me, oh, thank you. I like how it deletes both, but I only want to delete one. Okay, so now it's saved. I come back over, I refresh the page. I have a little bit more context, but I really don't have what I need, right? Okay, so what if I actually create some new object that has the student whose student ID is 1 and the course whose course ID is 3? Can I do that? Okay, so I want to, right? So what I want to do is I want to return some new object. But that new object, I want to have the student being some value, and I want the course being some value. Can I just use the get student by ID method? This is how I traditionally program it, right? Is this going to work? Okay, and then what I'll do is then I'll just console.log my registration details. Okay, and I'll get rid of the 2 console.log messages because those weren't contributing to anything. I just want to log the whole collection that I mapped. Okay, I refresh this. What's going on there? I'll blow up the font so you can see it a little bit better. Saying student is a promise and course is a promise. That's accurate, right? It's not a student until after that promise resolves. It's not a course until after that promise resolves. Everyone good with that? Like, this is happening sometime in the future. If I just call and ask you what the student ID is, it's a promise. It's not a student. So I want to do something like, I'm going to have an object. So here's my registration. It's going to be equal to an empty object. I'm going to call getStudentById. I'm going to pass in the registration.studentID. Then, once that's complete, I get a student, and I can say that the registration.student is the student that was sent over. So I get this promise. When it resolves, I get the actual student. I take the actual student and I say, for this registration object that I'm creating, it's an empty object, I'm saying that that student is the student that got resolved as a result of that promise. Okay? Life's good there?
How does it know that you want? Because you've got multiple properties in student, don't you?
I have multiple properties in student. Yeah.
So how does it know that you want the student name instead of student ID?
How does it know that I want the student name? So I want the student name and student ID. This student is that object. Yeah, it's both. So really what I'm returning is an object nested within an object. So the student is that student object that contains the ID and the name. Okay? Can I do the same thing for get course by ID? So if I say get course by ID, registration course ID, then course registration course equals the course that comes back, And then can I just return the registration? Logistically, I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page in terms of what we're doing. Are we okay with this? Yeah, I don't want to have that variable conflict, and so bad variable choice by me. So a registration from the collection is coming in, and then I'm calling my return value registration as well. I'm going to call this my registration detail, and then I'll update that. Good catch, thank you. Okay, so I go ahead and save this. I refresh the page. And life's good. This ends up happening more often than you'd think. And I shouldn't say that. This is the JavaScript world for working with database objects. I may not have a relational database. I might have a JSON file store. I might have a web service. And then I need to combine the two. I'm going to use JavaScript functions, map, reduce, filter, find, those array functions in combination with promises to create this solution. Now I actually have some meaningful data. Like these are my registrations. I can see Bill Gates registered for Node.js. And then you say, oh, what student ID is Bill Gates? I can look it. Or what's the course ID? I have that information. I have everything that I need right here. It happens all the time. So a lot of times in a relational database system, so if I'm using Oracle or MySQL or there's a million of them, so I don't even want to get into them. So if I'm using some kind of relational database system, I might create this relationship with SQL. Well, in the JavaScript world, my data might be coming from all over the place. It might be coming from a service. It might be coming from a relational database. It might be coming from a file on the file system. And I kind of just need to deal with it. I have unorganized data. It might be structured, but unorganized, not managed by a relational database system. Right? I have a bunch of files on the file system. Okay, I guess I have to deal with it. This is what you're going to end up doing. So it's kind of a hack because we don't have our data anywhere other than just variables in our application. But this is a really common application. Like I have these different data sources that I need to make relationships out of. It's not that hard. Return promises. And the reason you're going to return promises is there's that time delay. Anytime you have a time delay, I want you to start thinking promise. Yeah, I'll get it to you. No problem. Could I make the registration details a promise? Does it make more sense for me to return a collection of promise objects that I would then map over? Maybe. Okay. Maybe. I wouldn't necessarily jump right there, but it might make sense. Okay, what I'm going to suggest is there is not a lab where you deal with promises. So if you remember when we first started, can you create a generic promise? and then use that promise to get the data back out. Try it, because it's not necessarily intuitive. It doesn't necessarily click in your brain until you've written that code. So even though there's not a lab that you're getting credit for, this might be a time where, hey, let me try that really simple example that we did very first thing of class today. Try it out. See if you can create your own promise and use that promise to either reject or resolve it. Okay? Okay, so I'm going to stop here for today. No additional homework, right? Just the promises.